Okay. It's good afternoon. My name is Dale Goodson. I work with a wonderful organization called Adventist Friendship Missions. And been spending a little time with the local church here. And one of the I guess, passions that every church should have, and the church here is also wrestling with, is that of discipleship. So I wanted to spend a little time talking about discipleship. And over the years that I've been working either as a missionary, a trainer of missionaries, or simply just working with believers I know around the country and around the world, there's a lot of different perceptions of what discipleship entails and what it is. If people say, "Are you a disciple?" What are they referring to? And I've read a number of different documents that talk about discipleship. And what I would like to do today, rather than give like a modern perception of what discipleship is, just to get a picture of what discipleship was back when Jesus actually worked with his 12 disciples. And so to go back a little bit past that, if you look at discipleship as Christ practiced it, and the 12, Peter, James, John, as they were practicing discipleship, it was actually a teaching model. So you have a teacher, a master teacher, then you have his followers, and the whole point was for the followers to learn the ideology, the philosophy, the major teachings of the master teacher, with the intent that their lives would actually be improved, and then they would function as like an extension of the master teacher in the community around them. So rather than the master teacher himself trying to influence as many people as he could before he died, you'd have a number of other disciples following him to extend that influence out, and then have a greater influence over a larger portion of the population. If you go back in time, you have Adam, of course. He was the only one there. He would teach his children. And you move on, then you have the patriarchs of Abraham trying to teach his children, Isaac trying to teach his son, and then Jacob trying to teach his 12 sons. And then you have Moses with a much broader influence over the people of Israel. And then you had the priests. They functioned as teachers, people that model with truth to the rest of Israel. And then you had the judges. You had the judges and their influence. So you can see there's a number of different models being used over the years. And then if you read the Torah, not only did the priests and Levites function major roles trying to teach Israel, but you also had parents. And they were supposed to teach their children when they were laying down, when they were rising up, as they walked along the way. The parents would constantly be teaching the children. That's the ideal. And today, we don't have priests anymore. We don't have like judges in the same sense that they had back in the early days of Israel. We don't have kings functioning in that capacity. We no longer have like prophets like they functioned back in the days of the kings. But we do have parents. They still have that role, critical role, and we notice it's being attacked by the world. Families are being torn apart, and it's a lot harder for parents to fill that same role that they had initially. But we do have, when Christ came, he introduced a different model that we can still practice, and that was that of discipleship. And if you look at the time frame Christ lived in, you had the Pharisees with their disciples. We had John the Baptist. He also had disciples. And then some miles distant, they had the Essenes, another group of people that lived there by the Salt Sea. And they had a large community also intended to lead and to guide and help people develop better habits and live righteous, holy lives. And as the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, entered the caves, found these ancient writings. Among them was like a code of behavioral code for people who lived in these communities of the Essenes. And they were designed such that let's say that you move into the community, you want to be one of the Essenes, you could do that. If you had a wad of cash, you would unload that. They would keep an accurate record of how much you're bringing into the community. They would set it aside, and then they would monitor the way you live for the next 2 years. They wanted to make sure that you actually lived a holy, noble, righteous life. And if you lived good enough and you set a good enough example to the community, then they would say, okay, find the guy's money. They keep a record of it. They take it back out, and now they would use it. But you had to live a really holy life for that to happen. And if they didn't think you were holy enough, they would turn you loose, and you'd give you back your money, and you leave again. And so it really was important for them to, thank you, it really was important for them to be able to justify the fact that they would live in that community if they wanted to do that. So they had to live really clean lives. And after they passed that first 2 years, then what they would do is they would assign them a position. So let's say we have 1,000 people here. These are the most righteous, and then these are real close. And then, coming on down, they would take this newcomer and they'd fit him in there somewhere, depending how righteous he lived during those first 2 years, and be like a pecking order or a class. And ever after that, once a year, they would kind of evaluate everybody and then readjust things as they needed to figure out, okay, who was the most righteous and who was less righteous, and all the way down. And then, if you're the most righteous, then you kind of have a little bit of authority over those who are below you. And if you're near the bottom, then all of the people above you, they can kind of tell you, well, you need to be doing this different, you need to be doing that different, you need to. And then weekly, they'd also have evaluations to decide, okay, who had done some righteous stuff, who did some things that maybe weren't so righteous. And if you fell asleep in church, or fell asleep in, not church, but in their religious meetings, if you had fasted like you were supposed to, if you were late for any meetings, and if you fell asleep in church, they may say, well, obviously you're not very holy. Look, you fell asleep, so we're not going to give you these next 3 meals, or we're gonna give you a whipping or a beating, or some way of reminding you, don't do that again. Don't fall asleep during meetings. You got to stay awake if you're going to be holy. So they tried to encourage holy behavior with external influences such as beatings or missing your meals or whatever else they assigned to you. So they would have their weekly evaluations, and the whole idea was that they'd create this environment, this context that would really encourage holy, righteous living for the people who lived in there. So they would screen out, to start with, they would screen out everybody that wasn't holy enough. That was step number 1. And then they would monitor behavior, and then they would punish misbehavior. So the three, and then they would reward you if you were holy enough by giving you some level of authority over the people who were underneath you. So there's several pieces to this puzzle, but they're all designed to encourage holy living. If you're going to be a disciple of one of the Pharisees, there again, they wanted to screen out all the riffraff and less holy people, because there was a risk if you were a Pharisee and you have 10 disciples. If those disciples don't live up to your teaching and your philosophy, then it makes you look bad, because people look at the disciples and say, really? I mean, is that what this guy's philosophy looks like if people practice it? And so they don't want that. They want to avoid that risk. So they want to choose the best of the best at the very beginning, so that when people do look at their disciples, they're actually looking at a picture of what the master teacher's teaching and philosophy looks like, and see, okay, if the whole community embraced that, what would it look like? They could look at the disciples and see, oh, they would act like that. We would get along like that. I mean, that was the kind of relationship we would have. So they could look at the disciples and see, this is the end result of this guy's philosophy and his teachings. So it was a big deal when you choose disciples, to choose someone who would actually portray what you're teaching to the people around. Again, they function as an extension of the master teacher in the community. So when Jesus chose his 12 disciples, it's a fascinating thing to look at what it looked like. So I'm going to look at Mark chapter 3:13 with you. So if you have a Bible, I encourage you to look with me. Matthew 3:13. And it says this, very simple. It says, and Jesus said to them, hang on here. Okay, Mark 3:13. And he went up on the mountain, and he called to them those he himself wanted. So, theoretically, if a master teacher was going to teach or have disciples, he would choose the people that had the least amount of risk to his teaching and the greatest opportunity for his teaching to be promulgated throughout the community. And we have this picture. He went up to the mountain, called those he himself wanted. So Jesus wanted these. And Luke says that before he chose the 12, he spent all night in prayer, like really begging God for wisdom to choose the right ones. Chose those he himself wanted, and they came to him. And then he appointed the 12. And who did he choose? He chose fishermen, a tax collector, zealots, people that were ready to get out and fight. He chose people that no other master teacher would have chosen because they were far too risky, way too risky. Normally they would choose the best out of the best, 2 years entrance exam, kind of thing. And he chooses the people that nobody else would choose. And that brings the question, why? Like, why would Jesus choose these kind of people to represent what he was doing? And that's because as a master teacher, Jesus knew that his philosophy and his teaching would work with anybody. The idea he was wanting people to realize is that you don't have to be perfect to be a disciple. That the teaching and the training and the relationship with God, the Holy Spirit working in your life, that's enough to change anybody. Enough to change anybody. It's not this thing, if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, that you have to have a 2-year entrance exam first. It's not like that. You don't have to be able to have memorized the entire Torah in order to be a disciple of Jesus. He'll take anybody, and he's the one that changes you. You don't have to be perfect coming in. Anybody can come in, because the changing takes place on the inside. The changing takes place after you met Jesus. That's when the change takes place. So being a disciple of Jesus is different than the common models of discipleship, because it was the relationship with him that made the difference. And it's true. We can see how the 12, one chose himself to bow out. That was Judas. The other 11 had remarkable changes in their lives, remarkable, profound changes in their lives. And they went on to basically plant the church that spread out throughout the whole world. And today they figure about 1/3 of the world's population professes Christianity. We'll be looking a little bit more about, let's look at it now. So we've got our 10 blocks here. If each of these blocks represents, I don't know if the camera can be brought down to see the table. If each of these blocks represents 10% of the world's population, then that would be 10%. Perfect. There's 10%. I'll get these out of the view there. There's 10% of the world's population, and I'll do it this way, 30%. So about 1/3 of the world's population consider themselves Christians. Okay? About 10% consider themselves Christians. And then of these 10%, of these 30%, about 10% actually practice. They go to church, they read their Bibles on a regular basis, they pray. So you've got about 10% who practice, and you have about 20% who call themselves Christians, but are Christians in name only. So they'll still cuss and swear, eat whatever they want. They basically live unconverted lives, but if you ask them, they'll say, oh yes, I believe in Jesus. Doesn't everybody? So you've got the 10% who actually practice, 20% who do not. And then you have about 30% who live in the same communities as the practicing and the non-practicing, but they are not Christians. They do not profess to be. If you ask them, are they Christians, they will say no. So you have these here. And then I did read a statistic a while back that indicated that probably about a third of these have never even met a Christian. They don't know any at all. They're living in the same communities, but they simply don't know any Christian, no contact. And then you have about 40% of the Earth's population who do not live in the same communities as the practicing or non-practicing, and they don't have any contact with them. If you ask them, they may well tell you they have no idea what Christianity even is. So you've got the practicing, non-practicing, those who live in the same communities, and then you have those that are basically untouched or unreached by the gospel. So the point that Jesus had as he talked about discipleship in Matthew 28, 18 to 20, it says, this is the Great Commission, Matthew 20, 18 to 20. All authority has been given to me, Christ is speaking here, in heaven and earth. So Christ is saying, look, I have all authority. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. And the word nations here is referring to ethnic groups or people groups, ethnos. So he's saying, listen, I have all authority in heaven and earth. Therefore go and make disciples of all ethnic groups or all race groups. And baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you. So the whole concept of discipleship is you have a master teacher, then you have the disciples, and the disciples, they follow the master teacher. He teaches, they listen, and then their job is to put that into practice and then demonstrate before the surrounding community what that looks like. So Christ is now telling his disciples, okay, so the communities I want you to emulate my teachings in are basically every race and every ethnic group, every language group around the world. Like, that's where I want you to go. That's the scope of the work I have for you. So this concept of master teacher and the disciples, like that model was to continue on. So every believer then, as they embraced the teachings of Jesus, began putting them into practice, they would then model them to another part of the community, and they would teach other people. He says, look, I'm teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. So the disciple then would teach other people how to observe everything that Christ taught, and then they would become the next line of disciples that are out there taking Christ's teachings and then sharing them with the next group around them. So the work would just continue on growing. And as in an effort to do that, you can imagine Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they wrote the first four Gospels for us. But ask the question, why? So imagine Matthew is getting older. He's been working for several decades, and his job is to make disciples. And disciples had four characteristics. One, a disciple would make a commitment to following the master teacher and to being a model of the master teacher everywhere he went. He would follow his teachings, demonstrate them, teach them to people, but he himself was committed to the master teacher, to learning from that one source, his teacher. Then the second critical component of being a disciple was that you would actually study the teachings and philosophy of the master teacher. So you may have a commitment to him, study his teachings and philosophy, and third, you put them into practice. And these two go together, so you hear and obey. And that's why over and over and over, Jesus, he ties those two together. And so a lady comes to Jesus and says, "Oh, blessed is the womb who gave birth to you, and the breast that nursed you." And Jesus responds by saying, "Oh, blessed are those that hear the word of God and do it." Over and over, we have the story of the parable of the man who built the house on the rock in Matthew 7. And those who built the man who built his house on the sand. And Jesus said, well, the one who built this house on the sand, he's a foolish guy. That's like the one who hears these sayings of mine, but does not do them. But the one who built this house on the rock, that's the guy with wisdom. He's the one that hears these sayings of mine and does them. That's the concept of discipleship is built on hearing and doing. You hear the teachings, and then you put those teachings into practice. If you hear the teachings and do not put them into practice, you're not a disciple. You're a foolish man who built his house on the sand. You can expect a train wreck. You can expect your house or life to fall apart because you didn't build it on a strong foundation. The strong foundation are the teachings and philosophy of Jesus. You build your life on that. You hear and do. Then you're a disciple. So you're committed to the master teacher. You choose Jesus. You hear his teachings and philosophy, and you do them. And then you function as an extension of the master teacher in the surrounding community. So actually take these teachings and philosophy and leave, even though the master teacher is not there. You're still living like he is, and you're teaching his teachings and philosophy to the people around you, and you're encouraging them also to be his disciples. So at this point, you're rallying behind the master teaper. At this point, you're in the community functioning as a like a representative of the master teacher. You're his arm, long arm stretched out in the community. You're just stretching out a little further, getting his influence out there. So you're his protege, and you're the next master teacher. When Jesus went to heaven, he said, "Look, I'm leaving. You're the next disciples now. Everything I just taught you, you need to take it and start all over again and pass it on to more disciples." So it's really simple model. Be committed to the master teacher, study his teachings and philosophy, put them into practice, and then share them with other people. And one of the challenges we have here is, he's up here, one of the challenges we have here is that a lot of the people who have accepted salvation, they have not accepted the responsibility of being disciples. So while they're happy to be saved, happy to go to church, they're not actively accepting the responsibility for taking what Christ has taught them, his teachings and philosophy, and sharing them in a very personable way in the community around. And because of that, we have 2/3 of the people who call themselves Christians don't know how to take Christ's teachings and philosophy and put it into practice. They struggle with that. And because they're not, we have a large portion of the world's population live in the same communities as Christians, but don't see any reason to change. You're not seeing the teachings of Christ and his philosophy modeled around them that would make them think, wow, well, man, if that's what Christian is, I want that. I want my marriage to look like that. I want my kids to look like that. I want my life to be noble like that. I'm ashamed of the way I'm living. They don't see what they're looking for that would give them a reason to want to change, to want to be different, to want to embrace these teachings and philosophy of Jesus. So having an accurate record of what those teachings and philosophy look like is vital to being able to be that witness in the community around us, and then to give us a sense of responsibility that says, yes, look, there's a lot of people that don't have any idea what the teachings of Christ are. I need to get out there and share that with them. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they're getting older, you can imagine, for instance, Matthew, he says, look, the teachings and philosophy of Jesus, if people don't have that, there's no way they can put it into practice. I'm getting old. I'm going to die one of these days. Like, how do I ensure that the next generation has an accurate record of what the teachings of Christ and what his philosophy actually was? Like, how do I make sure that next generation isn't going to forget, or they're going to get confused and maybe think, oh, did he say the kingdom of heaven was, how did that go? And then he wants to make sure they don't get confused. So he said, listen, I need to make an accurate record of everything that Jesus taught, all of his parables, the way he lived his life, and then how he actually discipled me. I want people to know this is how he discipled me, what it looked like when Jesus was there, and the discussions that we had. And so he wanted to make sure there was an accurate record of that. Luke did the same thing. If you look at the first little bit of Luke, first couple of verses, he starts off by saying, inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the very beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account. So he goes on, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were already instructed. So as Luke writes to Theophilus, he says, look, there's already a number of people have made records of the teachings of Jesus. They made a record of everything that took place in his life. And he says, I was thinking you also need, Theophilus, you need a record. How can you be a disciple if you don't have an accurate record of what you're teaching and the philosophy you're trying to embrace? So I want to make sure you have an accurate record too. I'm writing this all out for you. I want to make sure you know. And so he writes out the book of Luke. So as we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we've often looked at them as historical documents. I'm convinced because of what discipleship is, that what they were looking for is not just to make like a historical record of what Jesus did, but to have a discipleship handbook, something that new believers could look at and say, oh, okay, this is the teaching that I'm supposed to be embracing. This is the philosophy I need to embrace. And these are the things I need to start doing. The idea of forgiving, I need to start doing that. Yeah, my marriage is falling apart. I don't want to divorce her. I need to actually just go back and ask the question, what did Jesus teach? And am I faithfully putting his teaching into practice? If not, maybe that's the reason why we're having trouble. So let's get back here and let's start getting back to the basics. I'm not seeing myself as a church member whose job it is to simply walk in the church, pay tithe, be faithful, study the Bible with everybody else, sit down, listen to the pastor. But I actually need to be a disciple, somebody who actively studies the teachings of Jesus, not just to know what they are, but to put them into practice so that my life can be salt, like Jesus said. Salt, we're the salt of the earth, the light. I can actually be a light. When people look at me, they don't say, oh man, I hope my marriage doesn't turn out like that. But they would look at me and say, listen, I really want a relationship with my wife like that guy has, a relationship with my husband like she has. Look how she treats her husband. That we can be that kind of salt and light to the communities around us. So as we look at the basic concept of discipleship really pulls people in close to the master teacher, and then once they embrace being disciples, it pulls them closer to their families, and it begins pulling them closer to people in the community. And so that the teachings that are taught orally, as well as the teachings that are modeled in our life, they would get passed on. A friend of mine, we have a little analogy that we used. It's like somebody selling vacuum cleaners. Knocks on the door, and they're selling vacuum cleaners. Okay, so we invite the vacuum cleaner salesman into the house. He comes in. What's the first thing he does? He turns his vacuum cleaner on and starts vacuuming your sofa and vacuuming the carpet, and then he has a clean, pure white filter. And he says, look, see this filter here? All that dirt, I got it out of your sofa. That's how bad your sofa is. Or I got it out of your carpet. Your vacuum cleaner is leaving it dirty. This one's leaving it clean. When people buy the vacuum cleaner, they're not really wanting an extra vacuum cleaner because they may well have one. When they make that purchase, the idea isn't I'll have a new vacuum cleaner. The idea is I'm going to have a clean carpet. Like that's what they're looking for. And it's the same when people embrace Christianity. The idea isn't that they'll have, I'll have a new religion, or I'll have a new church I'm going to go to. The idea is actually that they actually want their lives to improve. They want their marriage to improve. They're wanting something else, their lives to be cleaned up, right? They're really wanting, that's what they're looking for. And so one of the challenges with these blocks is that a large portion of these, I've heard as high up to 80%, are having a hard time figuring out how to get the vacuum cleaner to work to actually clean the house. They're Christians, they can't figure out how to get Christianity to work, but they're staying inside the church, hoping. These guys gave up. They said, listen, I don't know how it works, and they don't even try. And these people say, listen, I have no reason to change. Look, they're the same as I am, so why change? And these people over here don't have any idea. So as we think about discipleship, these people need to understand how to actually be disciples, to take Christ's teachings, to put them into practice. And a lot of them are needing someone to put their hand on their shoulder and say, listen, I've struggled with it. I've struggled with my marriage before. Here's some practical tips. Made a huge difference. I've struggled with my kids. I've struggled with temptation before, with pornography. I've just done some things that are shameful, embarrassing, but Jesus made a difference. These are the things I did. I practiced these things that Christ taught, made a huge difference in my life. If you're struggling with the same thing, I want to not just tell you what they are. I want to support you. I want to help you with it, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you, to take that element of the Great Commission, put it into practice. So these people are looking for that. Once they get it, then they can reach out to these people. And once they get it, then everybody gets one-on-one. If they would just take the time to do that, it wouldn't take long, and then you'd have this here, and then this would be a small challenge at that point. So the truth is we're desperate. The world is desperate, not for more churches, but for more disciples, more people to embrace that concept of discipleship and not try to make it complicated, leave it simple as it is, and begin putting it into practice. So to assist with that, I'd like to take a moment and look at a couple of things that stand out in Christ's discipleship of the 12, of the 70, of the hundreds of people that follow Jesus. We often think in terms of 12 disciples. There's also 70, or is debatable, 70 or 72. But there are places where it refers to, huge crowds of his disciples. So there's a lot of people following Jesus, maybe not every day like the 12, but we're still following Jesus and trying to put his teachings into practice. So a few of the things I'd like to bring to your attention. Hang on. One of which is, how big is this? So we think of the 40%. That's about 3 billion people. And when I first read 3 billion, I think, okay, that's 3 billion. I think currently they're claiming about 7,000 unreached people groups. So how many is 3 billion? And it's a fairly large number. I was born in 61. the world's population in 1960 was 3 billion. So there's as many unreached people in the world now as there were the entire world's population in 1960. That's quite a few. And if you take these people and had them hold hands, and to see how big the circle would be, if this was the circle, the earth, and all the 3 billion people were in a circle around the earth, that circle would be so big, if the earth was here, and I'll put the earth right there, and the moon is right here, that's 240,000 miles between the earth and the moon. The outside of that circle would be another 140,000 miles beyond the moon. So this would be a massive circle going around the earth. That seems totally impossible. I did the math over and over and over because I didn't believe it could possibly be true. The problem is 3 billion people is a lot of people. And Christ really wants those people in his kingdom, and he gave us this fascinating tool to reach out to those people, and that tool is called discipleship, real simple. And so I would like to do at this point is just give a little better feeling for what it would be like to be one of Jesus' early disciples, and what it was that they were practicing when they began practicing discipleship and went out to the world to reach the unreached and prepare them for his return. So the first thing I want to mention is ministry location. So, as a missionary, when I first went to Papua New Guinea, my idea of ministry was, well, you have a church, you gather everybody around, they all come inside the church building, and you begin having Bible studies. And on worship days, you'd have like a church. If you have a church, we had like an iron roof on poles, but no walls, but still you'd have a basic worship center. Everybody gathers in the center, and you begin having Bible studies. You have sing songs, pray together. Okay, that's what ministry looks like. So rather than having a model of discipleship, I had a model of church, doing church. And so we were doing church. And how many locations do we have? Well, one. We have the church. Or if people were struggling, we would go visit them at their house. We would pray with them there, have Bible studies there. So it's like two basic venues. But if you look at where Christ did his ministry, you see him in a boat. You see him on the shore. You see him walking on water. You see him on foreign soil. You see him with the Gentiles, and you see him among demons. Demon-possessed people, where like legions of demons. Like he's there. You see him in the temple. You see Jesus in Pharisees and rulers' houses, in the houses of tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. He's there. He's in the close houses of his friends. He's in the houses of his disciples. Jesus is in synagogues. If you go through the list, he's with the dead. He's at the tombs, raising the dead. He's outside as people are carrying the, bodies out. He's with those that have leprosy, with those that were sick, and those, like he's everywhere. He's by the pool of water. He's in the market. Everywhere there's people, that's where Jesus is at. He's all over the place. So when we think of church ministry, an evangelist, a Bible worker, was either in the church, in people's houses. Where did Jesus have his ministry? All over the place. He was all over his own home turf. He was all in foreign soil, even the Tyre and Sidon. He was over there. Jesus was everywhere people were at, because that's what a disciple does. A great teacher does, is he teaches people how to live out his philosophy in whatever context they're living. And that's why he was effective, because he modeled it all over. And that's why, as you read through, it's the next section here. As you read through some of the venues that Jesus taught, and how the circumstances, I'm looking for the circumstances in which he taught, You'll see there's some very planned events, and you'll see there's some very unplanned events. So we'll look at a few of these, such as Matthew, back up here. Okay, so Jesus tells how to handle temptation. How does he do that? He was actually in the wilderness being tempted, and we had that story, of being tempted by demons. How does he handle temptation? With Scripture. He memorizes Scripture, and he says, listen, regardless of what the devil asked me to do, this is what I'm grounded on. I'm doing what God told me to do, right? So, and he does that. So he loads himself up with Scripture, and that's what he uses to defend himself during temptation. So he's got that. He preaches to crowds. So we've got these massive crowds, and he teaches people there. That's where you have Matthew, the great lectures, the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. You've got great places where Jesus teaches, you've heard that it was said of old, you should not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause will be in danger of the judgment. And then he goes on. Look, if one of you brings a gift to the altar, and there that you remember that your brother has something against you, not that you have something against him, but he has something against you, how should you respond? He says, leave your gift right there at the altar. Don't even give it yet. Leave it at the altar and go. Just first be reconciled to your brother, and then come back and make your offering. And what would happen if we would just take that and put it into practice? That a man and his wife, they'd be on the way to church, realize, look, they've got some unfinished business, and said, listen, rather than going to church with hard feelings and anger, let's pull over the side of the road. Let's just make things right. Let's not hold grudges. I'd like to say I'm sorry if I've offended you. I want to change, and help me know how to make it right to you. I actually want a really good relationship with you. Be reconciled. It doesn't just say I'm sorry and then go on with it. It says be reconciled. Make sure your hearts are together again, right? If we would just take that and practice it, man, the world would be a better place. And but he teaches the great crowds, like the biggest part of his philosophy, out there to the crowds. People know this is what his kingdom is all about. If you're embracing what it means to be his student, his disciple, that's what you're embracing. This is it, right there. That's what Christianity is being reconciled, not only with God, with your brother as well. Reconciliation is the key piece of what Christ's philosophy, what his kingdom is all about. And you'll notice as you go down through a lot of Christ's teachings, you can't really perfect them in isolation. You can't perfect love in a cave, because love is not just something that's just by itself. Love is relational. It's like one person having affection for and a burden for the well-being of another person. So love is relational. Mercy, you can't practice mercy all by yourself in a cave. Mercy is relational. So mercy is when someone has a severe need and you have compassion over them. Compassion, again, is relational. So then you'd want to assist them, right? Or maybe they've done something to deserve punishment, but you extend mercy on them, so you're not going to give them that punishment. So all of the things that Christ is teaching, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers. These are all interrelational qualities. So as you look at the teachings of Jesus, he's really trying to pull families together, to pull communities together, to pull people of countries together. His kingdom is all about reconciliation. And you're embracing that if you're embracing being a disciple of his. If you're accepting Christianity, that's what you're accepting. And so we have his preaching to the crowds, and that's part of that teaching. Very fundamental foundation stones for his kingdom. If you're building your house on that, that's what you're building on. Then he's got teachings in private. A lot of his parables were being taught in private. Talk to Nicodemus. We have the great quotation, for God to love the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. We have that that quote came from his conversation with Nicodemus. And what does it mean to be born again? So, and Nicodemus says, how can a man be born again when he's old? How can I possibly do that? That came in a personal relationship. And then the woman at the well, again, very private communication right there. So Jesus was with massive crowds. He's also with one-on-one. He was with just his 3 disciples, the Peter, James, and John. Then with the 12, they had the inner core and the outer core. And then you have lessons from Jesus, not just the preaching or the teaching. I would say preaching to the masses. Teaching is more to the one-on-one or the small group. You've also got lessons from his example. So that's where the temptation comes in. And then prayer, when Jesus was going to choose the 12, huge responsibility. He wanted to make sure he did not make any mistakes on that. So what did he do? He spends all night in prayer. And we've got other mentions also of him spending all night in prayer. And so we have that example. And then his disciples were so impressed that came to him and said, Jesus, teach us how to pray. We want to know how to pray just like you're praying. And so he taught them. And one of the fascinating things is he says, listen, and he gives us what we now call the Lord's Prayer. And at one time in Matthew, he records that Jesus said, listen, don't pray like the heathen. He'll repeat the same prayer over and over and over and over and over, assuming that if they pray enough times that God will listen to them. He said, don't do that. He said, and then he gave him a really simple prayer. He says, pray after this fashion, right? And he says, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. But he says, don't repeat it over and over and over. He said, just after this fashion. So the idea is not that we would keep saying the Lord's Prayer over and over, but we would just have this really simple prayer, trusting that God would take care of our needs and that he would forgive us, and that we would also be inspired to want to forgive other people. Like that's all part of the Lord's Prayer. So what brought that out was his disciples asked him, teach us to pray. And he gave a really simple example of how to pray. And one thing I have noticed is that we've kind of missed the point. Here we are years later, and quite often we repeat the same prayer over and over and over, as opposed to just taking that style of prayer and just realizing that, look, I don't have to make it complicated, be real simple, just ask God to take care of my daily needs and just leave my life in his hands. That's enough, and he'll honor that. He hears me because he already loves me. So just hold on to that. So the very simple teachings, they see him praying, want to pray like it. And then even Christ's death, he gave us an example in his death, willingness to serve all the way to the end. As he mentioned, greater love hath no man than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. And incidentally, it's fascinating to me that Christ gave that example, and all of his disciples followed it. Every one of them were willing to die for other people. And we know that Stephen died, James died, he was one of the 12, right after, just short time after Christ did. And all of the other disciples, except for John, were martyred for their faith. They tried, evidently, church history says they tried to boil John in oil, didn't die, and so he ended up being exiled to Patmos. And so all of them were willing to die for their faith. Why? Because they're disciples of Jesus. And disciples of Jesus are willing to embrace death. If that's what the best way to move God's work forward, they'll embrace that. So truly disciples. And then you have Jesus' devotion. And this is modeled in one of the most fascinating ways. If you look at Matthew 26, this is where Jesus talks to his disciples, verse 31 and 32, where he tells his disciples, 31, he says, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. So he tells them, you're all going to stumble because of me. And then the next verse says, but after I've been raised, I'll go before you into Galilee. So he says, listen, you're all going to be traitors tonight. Every one of you. You're all going to turn your backs on me. But after I'm raised from the dead, I want to meet you over in Galilee. It's like, okay, so he says he knows they're going to betray him, but he's already making plans to meet them again on the other side. And to me, that's the most beautiful example of faithfulness and loyalty you can possibly imagine, to know someone will betray you and say, listen, I want to get together with you on the other side. And if you read the story, he actually prepared breakfast for him. Like, he actually feeds him after that. And so his devotion and sense of purpose, if you look at Matthew 9:9-13, you get this beautiful picture of his sense of purpose. And so we have Matthew 9:9-13, where Jesus says, and it says, and Jesus passed on from there. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, follow me. So he arose and followed him. And then the next picture we see of Jesus, he's actually in Matthew's house. So if you understand the social scene at the time, you have the spiritual elite, you've got the priests, the Levites, the scribes, Pharisees, the really clean people, and they try to isolate themselves from all the social outcasts or the spiritual outcasts, people that are not holy enough or righteous enough. They keep those separated. They don't even eat. If they bring food from the market, they're going to wash their hands first in case they've been contaminated by unclean people in the market. So they're going to wash. And Jesus is now in the home, sitting down with people that the religious elite would claim are dirty. Like, these are not righteous, clean, holy people. And what in the world is Jesus doing eating with them? It doesn't make a bit of sense. And but Jesus was saying, listen. So they asked his disciples, and this is the thing you see trade off back and forth. That they go to Jesus and say, oh, Jesus, your disciples, they're actually harvesting grain and eating it. And they tell his disciples, look, your master's eating with tax collectors and sinners. They're constantly trying to break up this teacher discipleship model, making fun of Jesus, that his disciples aren't good enough, making fun of the disciples, that the master teacher isn't good enough. They're constantly trying to break this apart and saying, well, look, we fast. How come you guys aren't fasting? Good disciples should fast. All master teachers should fast. Are you not doing that? Constantly attacking this. And this is another opportunity, attacking again. And so Jesus sat at the table. Tax collectors and sinners came down with him and sat with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Like, he is not a good teacher. You really shouldn't be following him. Like, so they're kind of throwing it at the disciples. Jesus hears it. How does he respond? He says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So he clarifies his mission. He has a mission, and anybody who is truly a disciple of Jesus embraces that same mission, which is what the disciples did and why they went out carrying the word everywhere they went, and why the gospel has got to the point where we have it now. Basically, a third of the world have access to it, right? So actually a half, but a third of them have at least started the process of embracing it. So you have a number of places where Jesus teaches, and then you have and his example that he demonstrates, and then you have unplanned events, such as Matthew 15:1-3. We'll turn there. Matthew 15:1-3. Then it describes the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the, again, you see this, trying to pull them apart. Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. And here again, you got the hand washing, want to keep yourselves pure. And they're lifting up like this model of being, what does it take to be righteous? You got to do all this stuff. Like the Essenes had, they had that model of what you had to do. The Jews and Pharisees in Jerusalem also had their own list of rules. If you do all of these things, then you're holy, then you're righteous. Live up to all of this. And they were saying, well, listen, your disciples aren't doing that. That's a problem. They're not good disciples. Look, because they're breaking this, not even washing their hands here. And so Jesus responds by saying, why do you also transgress? But he doesn't say the traditions of men. He said, look, you're transgressing the commandments of God by your traditions. So it's possible to create man-made traditions that actually violate God's commandments. And then he gives actually a 10 commandment example. God commanded, honor your father and your mother. And he says, but you are allowing children to disobey or to dishonor their parents. And he gives an example of how they're doing that. And he says, look, you made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. So disciples of Jesus, as we wrestle with why the four Gospels were written, they're written so we know what Christ's teachings are, his philosophy, what it is, and we can begin embracing that. So as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, as they wrote these training documents out, the idea was that people who wanted to follow Jesus would know this is what Jesus does. Okay, it's what he does. Jesus keeps the Sabbath. It's how he keeps the Sabbath. There again, you read a little later, which Jesus says, look, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So he claims himself to be the Lord of the Sabbath. And he says, look, don't allow your human man-made traditions violate God's commandment. And it's very possible to do that in a range of ways, not just with Sabbath, but with marriage and divorce, with idol worship. You can go all the way down the list, taking God's name in vain. We actually committing adultery. We actually live in a society that very intentionally attacks every single one of the 10 commandments. Every one just attacks and Jesus is saying, listen, how is it that you've even developed, really, if you can imagine, Jesus saying you have traditions that are attacking God's commandments. How can that possibly be in God's benefit? So he wrestles with that. So you have that. Then you have plucking grain on the Sabbath. We mentioned that. And then Matthew 12, 9 to 14. A couple pages back. Matthew 12, 9 to 14. Now when he departed from there, he went into a synagogue. Behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Again, we're looking for a way to accuse him. And then he says, what man is there among you who has a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and bring it out? How much more value then is a man than a sheep? Saying that the man is worth more than the sheep, right? If you can rescue a sheep, why can't I rescue a man? And then he says, therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So they begin asking the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And he turned it into a question of saying, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Which is really more the heart of what his kingdom is all built on. Not so much a long list of rules. Is this on this rule list or not? But saying, listen, is it okay to do good? His kingdom is all about doing good. So that's how he answers that. And so you have all these lessons from unplanned events and how Jesus responds to all these people attacking him, trying to lay traps for him, trying to trick him, trying to get him to pick fun of him, make fun of what he's doing. And so you have all these unplanned events and how he responded. And then we have all these great discipleship lessons we can learn from that. And then we have crafted events. For instance, Luke 5, 1 to 11. Luke 5, 1 to 11. And here we have, so it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, he stood by Lake Gennesaret. There were 2 boats. His disciples are washing their nets. He sent them back out to fish. Again, tells them to throw the net on the other side. They, on the side there, they throw the net in, catch fish, and then they bring it in. And he said, okay, you've caught fish now. I want to teach you how to catch men. So he actually crafts an event that would create a life experience that would change the way they think forever. And so good discipleship is unplanned events. It's also well-planned events, very highly crafted events that would give lessons, life lessons that disciples would need to learn to challenge them to think different, to embrace life different. Yeah, and to be disciples of Jesus. So you have the very planned events. Lord's Supper was another planned event. Sending out the 12 and the 70 to practice what he taught them. Casting out demons, well-planned event. Even one of his disciples, he comes and says, Nathaniel, he says, how can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Jesus sees him and says, oh yeah, before you were underneath the fig tree, I saw you. He says, what? How did you see me there? So he's convinced he's a prophet. But Jesus thought about that early, and he said, look, I know that guy. He's asking underneath the fig tree, he's asking, how could I possibly be a prophet? How could I reach that guy? And he thinks very carefully, how do I reach a person like that? And he gives him what he needs. And I think today too, there's a place for people to reach out to God, to ask for help, and be able to provide people what they're needing to help them to realize that, yeah, He is God and He can change their lives. And as disciples today, we need to be wrestling with how best to work with God, to not just manage unplanned events in a way that honors Him, but to also reach out into planned events and ask ourselves, how can we assist people and place them in a spot where they can see what Christianity is, taste it, touch it, feel it, and want it. Yeah, so you've got unplanned events, you've got planned events. And then you've got events from Christ when He had to correct His disciples when they're making a mistake, like who's the greatest? And He has to stop and say, no, listen, that's not what it's all about. It's not what it's all about. It goes on, you got several pictures provided, the same general context. If you want to be great, then you need to be a servant. And if you want to be like these children right here. See, it points back to what this kingdom really is all about. It's not about being great. It's about serving and making life great for other people. So he pushes that. So you got these lessons of correction. His disciples came and said, look, the guys over there, they were casting out demons. We told them not to because they weren't one of your disciples. And Jesus said, listen, if they're not working against us, they're working for us. Don't trouble them. And then they kind of said, listen, we were going to sleep here on the way back to Jerusalem in the city of Samaritans, but when they found out you're not going to stay here for a while, you want to go all the way to Jerusalem? He said, we were thinking maybe we should call fire down from heaven and fall them. That'll teach them, next time they need to not do that. Jesus said, no, I didn't come to destroy. I came to what? To save. So these are all lessons that came as He was correcting His disciples' misbehavior, misunderstanding of His kingdom. So there's a whole handful of corrections and lessons we can learn from those. So as we're looking at the various ways that Christ discipled the 12 and the crowds that followed Him, there's a couple of things that stand out. And one of them, I'm going to go back to it again, and that's the hearing and doing. You'll hear Jesus say over and over again, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And if you were a Hebrew listening to that, you wouldn't be thinking, oh, I have ears, I'm just going to let it go in. Here in the States, we sometimes say, yeah, it went in one ear and out the other. In other words, they weren't paying attention. If I tell my kid, hey, listen, can you pick up your socks before you leave? And they get up and walk out and leave the socks there. I said, listen, didn't you listen to me? When I said, no, didn't you listen? What I really mean is you heard me, but you didn't do it, right? So discipleship, when Jesus says, listen, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. He's meaning don't just hear, but hear it and do it. So Christ constantly couples these two, hearing and doing, together. In fact, as he was out there on the storm, there's big violent waves, the boat's being rocked around, and the disciples are afraid they're gonna capsize and all drown. they reach out to Jesus. He wakes up and he speaks to the storm and says, okay, calm down. And all of a sudden the winds and the waves, they all calm down. And his disciples are shocked. And they said, even the wind and the waves, what? Hear and do. Even nature is a disciple to Jesus. They listen and do it, right? So it's kind of like a play, a little, just just shocked. Even the nature is a disciple to Jesus. So I wanted to share a story. I was in New Guinea some years back, and I worked in this village called Kuki'ipa. And so for years we had a little congregation there, and they kind of backslid. And we had a young boy. He was a youth, got married, and his marriage was a disaster from the beginning. He was not happy with his wife. She was not happy with him. They fought a lot. They had a reputation for arguing, throwing things around, using profanity, physical, fighting. And the young guy wanted to learn how to read. And I had a Bible in his language, and my wife was giving literacy classes in Melodies and Tokpizin, so he could read that. And so he got the Bible. I gave him a Bible. My wife taught him how to read it. And she said, look, might as well just practice. It's good reading. So he began reading. He read through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, began working his way through, and he got lost in there around Isaiah somewhere, and kind of set it aside. And then he said, no, I need to go back and read it again. So he went back, started with Genesis, began working his way through, and as he did, his life began changing. He quit being angry. He got into the teachings of Jesus and realized the importance of forgiveness, not holding bitterness, of actually being a peacemaker. If his wife was angry with him, to want to make peace, and leadership, leading through example, that you actually serve, you actually model what you're teaching, because what Christ teaches is not 2 + 2 = 4. He's actually teaching lifestyle changes. So the best way to teach is actually to model it. Like that's how his kingdom is taught. So this guy begins reading those teachings and thinking, I need to start doing that. And as he did, his end of the fighting stopped. His wife may be angry, he's not, and so she's yelling at him and saying things, and and he's responding with, let me help you with the dishes, or let me help you with this, or you look, you're tired, and I kind of massage your shoulders. And she got feeling really uncomfortable with that. She said, listen, you don't know how to fight. It's like, to fight, like I have to hit you, then you hit me back. Like that's how fighting works. And if I'm hitting you and you're not hitting me back, it's kind of awkward. So she goes, I need you to do your part, as we both, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. And she says, look, just quit being a Christian. I don't like it. Just stop being a Christian. He says, no, I'm not going to stop. She goes, please. If I'm the only one ugly, it's really uncomfortable. So I need both of us to be ugly, and then it works real well. I'm happy with that. So he says, I'm not going to do that. She says, well, listen, if you're going to insist on following the Bible and not being mean and ugly back to me, then you got to teach me how to do the same thing, because I'm not going to be the only one being nasty. And he said, okay, I'll do that. So they began working together, reading the Bible together, and learning how to forgive, how to make peace, how to be kind. In the process of doing that, she began looking at her kids. They were dirty. She goes, no, I gotta clean them up. She got her kids and began washing all the dirt off, and then she noticed all their sores went away, all like the fungus that was growing there, and all the little infections were going away. She goes, that's interesting. So that she looked around and noticed her neighbor's kids still had all those fungus and little infections and little stores, and so she went over to the neighbor and said, look, I know how to fix that. And so she said, look at my kids. And she looked at her kids, but my kids are fatter than they used to be. They used to be all skinny, and they're a lot healthier. And she says, listen, I want to show you some things. We're eating different here. And going through the Bible, and we're eating a little different. And we're washing, and we're washing their clothes. And look at the different, let me show you how to do it. She took their kids down, washed them all up, began washing their clothes, and saying, look, you watch, your kids will look different. And pretty soon, there's 2 families with the kids all healthy, all the sores are gone. And then they went out and found other families, and pretty soon there's 4 families with clean kids, and healthy kids, and clean clothes, and houses were clean. And then she started saying, listen, we used to fight just like you. Remember us? You know, there's some things that we did different to change all that, and began talking about some of the teaching of Jesus about forgiveness and learning to work together and servant leadership. And pretty soon you had 2 families following the teaching of Jesus, and getting together and praying together, and then 3 families following the teaching of Jesus, and then 4, and then 5. What they were doing was, what I tended to do when I was there, and I'm telling you the truth, I would focus on rallying people together for church, and for Friday night, Vespers programs, and we'd have a youth program, or Sabbath evening. We have the programs at the church. This young guy, Paul Awake, he was doing church not in buildings, but in homes of people. And he wasn't talking about it, he was modeling it, and then coaching them as they took the teachings of Jesus and put them into practice, and that changed the community. I learned a lot from Paul. I was asked to do some training up in the Sepik region of New Guinea, and one of the workers there said, listen, people here, they won't come to church. And I said, well, we can take the church into the community. And they said, how do we do that? And I said, well, we've got the young men here, the ones that you say don't come to church, but how many burdens do these young men have? How many questions they have, areas they need help in just growing up to become mature adults? What are some of their questions and concerns? And does the Bible have any answers for that? And if it does, how do we take these answers and actually provide it in a meaningful way so that their lives are changed? So, okay, yeah, they have a number, and we began wrestling with, we began talking with them, making a list of concerns that they had, and then looking for what the Bible had to offer, and then providing it for them in a way that was meaningful and on their turf. And they came, they were happy, and they begged us to keep doing this. They said, man, please, no one's done this for us before. We need this kind of help. So later on, years later, we were in a different part of the country in Western Province. And again, there's this question of how do we best serve the people here? So we compared the idea of having church in church, or taking the teaching of Jesus and bringing them into the community and offering the people to wrestle with the concerns that they had. And so we talked to a couple of boys and said, listen, tomorrow we're going to have a meeting over there. And we wanted to just help boys learn how to be men. So when they walk to the community, the older people look at them and say, man, do you see that guy? I want my daughter to marry him. He's the perfect, he's a dude, he's a perfect guy. He's just respectful, he's kind, he's hard work. You see the muscles in that guy? He uses them wisely too. And he's so patient. He's just so tender with the little kid. I want him in the family. If you want to be respected like that, we have a little program here. We want to help you to meet that ideal. And we told a few guys, we weren't really sure how many would show up the next morning. I was hoping we'd have at least 8 or 10. We showed up and they started pouring in. Not the guys you would find in church, not even close. They, the long hair dudes and just rough. There were guys that were involved in the drug business and drinking. They were the ones that the elders in the community were afraid of. And they showed up. There's 50 of them. I would have been happy to have 10. There was about 50. And as they showed up, we began the program and began just serving their needs, trying to figure out what their burdens that they had and how we could assist with that. And come to realize that all of these guys, all these young men, didn't like who they were. They knew that people didn't trust them. They knew that no one wanted them to marry their kids. They knew they weren't respected, and they wanted to change that, but they didn't know how. And they really wanted to be different, and we're needing someone to assist them with that. And when they realized that we really did care, and we wanted to take very practical assistance and just show them how to use it to turn them into, to help them to grow up into men. You know, they loved it. They thanked us over and over. And I remember at one critical point in the program, we talked about what a perfect wife would look like. And as the young man began painting his picture, the woman, oh, she would be hardworking, she'd be kind, she'd be happy all the time. When we came home, there'd always be a smile on her face. Like, that's the kind of wife we're looking for. We want one that never cusses and swears, that has good food in the home, that the home would just be so peaceful. Like, that's what we're looking for. She wants to be clean. We want her to be clean, dressed nice. When we come home, she has nice clothes on, you know. She's beautiful when we show up. And it should be patient. And, oh, we want her to be a Christian. I said, you want your wife to be a Christian? Oh yeah, the perfect wife would be a Christian. So we made a list, had a board there. We made a list of all the characteristics of the perfect wife. And then we had some team building activities. They learned how to work together and how they were involved with other things. I took their list. My wife was actually having another program for young ladies that wanted to be respected as virtuous, you know, honorable women in the community. She had a program for them at a distant location. We met in the middle and we swapped lists. So I took the women's ideal of the perfect man back. My wife took what the husbands were looking for back where the ladies were. And as the men got together again, I put the list up on the board and said, okay guys, this is what these women are looking for. When they look for a perfect husband, this is what they want. And I said, the last thing you want is for the perfect woman to walk by, look at you, and not see the perfect man. Because they're not going to stop and say, how do you do? And they're going to want to keep on going. You don't want that. So when the perfect woman comes by and looks at you, you want her to think, oh, that's what I've been looking for all these years. And, you know, that's what you're looking for. So are you ready? Are you that? You know, if they look at you, are they going to see what we have on the board there? And these guys looked at that and looked at me and said, no, not even close. Like, we're not even close to being that. So then at that point we said, okay, so if you're not, would you like to be that? And they answered, yes, absolutely, we want to be that. We want to be exactly what those ladies are looking for. How do we do that? And on that list, what women were looking for in the perfect husband was the word Christian. They wanted a man who did not cuss and swear. They wanted a man that was patient, that was kind, that would treat them like a treasure. They wanted a man who loved Jesus, would worship with them, and pray when they had trouble, ask God for help. That's what they were looking for. And so as we began walking through that, they just looked at that and said, how do we, like, that is, like, we're way over here, that's like way over there, how do we get over there? And said, okay, it'll take time, we'll start right here. And we chose a few things and began working with them. And one of the things that we introduced to them was the fact that God also wanted them to meet that ideal. God also wanted them to be clean and cheerful and happy and treat their wife, God's daughter, like a treasure and be peacemakers in the community. That's what Christ's government is based on. So Christ wanted that too. And so we talked about the fact that God was willing to listen to them. If they wanted to pray, He'll help them with that. So how do we pray? So we began talking about how to pray, and again, following Christ's counsel, make it simple. And so we knelt down with these 50 men, and one of the most shocking things to me was to see these guys that would never put the shadow in the church, kneeling on the ground and begging God to help them to be his sons, you know, valuable, honorable sons of His, and to be the kind of husband that a righteous woman would want to marry. So touching. They wanted to help. My concern is that quite often we develop programs for church based on having Bible studies and providing doctrine, and, you know, want them to come and not very many people come, but people want the kind of help that God offers, They want it. They just don't know that it's here. And not enough of us are working as disciples to actually bring that to them and show them how it's done. And there again, I think it's good to be a church member. There's a great role for that, a reason for that. But Christians and church members need to not stop there, but to also embrace what it means to be a disciple, and to actually go about the kind of discipleship activity that builds the kingdom and reaches out to people like that. So anyway, again, just a few, some of the basic principles of discipleship. We could go on a lot longer. I'm not wanting to make this a long and tedious presentation, but simply to understand the very basic concepts of what discipleship is, and how to go about using it and implementing it in a very practical way in the communities around us. Now, I would like to talk just a little bit more about discipleship, but as I do, we're going to have a short, a few minutes a little bit later on for people that have questions about discipleship and how to apply it. So if you did have a few questions and you wanted to ask, you're more than welcome to do so. What you would do is you would simply send it, I'm assuming this is email, so you would email the questions to mail@betterlifetv.tv. So if you want, I don't know if you have it on the screen, or I can simply do this. If you wanted to zoom that, you could see that real easy. It's on the screen. Either way, you've got it now. Email questions to mail@betterlifetv.tv. I'll give you a second there. Yeah, just email your questions there. And again, I have a little bit more to share. Then we'll take a break for a few minutes, and during that time, you can send in or email your questions in. So. So I have another section here. It would take us a while to go through it. It's basically talking about Christ's methodology. So it's like a new section. And one of the most fascinating things that I think are not talked about enough is how Christ actually went about his ministry. So one, he's got disciples. So we've got that teacher-disciple relationship as like one of the elements of discipleship, having that close relationship where people trust the guy teaching and they're working together, right? So you've got that relationship. Christ physically served his disciples and other people. He healed, he cast out demons, he fed them, he physically served people. He was willing to do that. So it's another piece of what does it mean to be like a disciple today, and to carry on that discipleship work, physically serve people. 3, he was a model. So he didn't just tell you what to do, he actually modeled it. If he wanted you to heal, cast out demons or heal people, he actually did it. And this is how you do that. So he modeled it to people. He modeled service. He modeled the great leadership, right? So he modeled that. So he lived it out. Then you have, he was relational, highly relational. In fact, if you want to read the gospel that's the most relational, that depicts that, it's the book of John, because John was written for non-believers to encourage them to believe. So of the 4 discipleship, you've got the commitment to Jesus, listening to his teachings, putting them into practice, and then sharing with others. John, his focus is on helping you take this step here to being a disciple, just making that commitment to Jesus. That's what John's all about. So as you read through John, you realize there's a lot in John that's simply not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that's why. That they're written to actually grow. It's like a handbook for people who've already taken that step, and or perhaps you could say walking through all 4 steps. John, he's got a very specific focus, and he says it several times, that you may believe, that you may believe. Like he's trying to get people to take that step and embrace being a disciple of Jesus. So, and because he's doing that, I believe he's also illustrating the fact that why would anybody want to be a disciple of Jesus? And it's because Jesus passionately loved people. He passionately loved people. If you were a disciple of Jesus, Jesus would love you. And he would just love the fact that you were there. And the relationship you had with Jesus would be very, very close, very relational, very one-on-one. That Jesus loves to rebuild people's lives. He loves to heal if you're sick. If you're having problems, he wants to be there to address it. Like that's the Jesus that John was trying to portray. And there's a reason why John felt people needed him, because he really did care. He wasn't just someone that had all the right rules. If you just follow me, you'll get all the right rules, you can make it to heaven. No, he wanted a relationship with him. Like that's how people came in. So John wrote this gospel so you could see who Jesus was and why you needed him so badly. So John's the really relational one. So Jesus was relational. One-on-one, we see that over and over and over. Then he preached to crowds with methodology. On the one level, huge crowds. Small groups, you can see that with like the 12, right? Then you have the very involved, right? So when Jesus was feeding the 5,000, he didn't just tell his disciples, look, you sit there and watch, I'm going to show you how it's done. He said, no, I got to feed the 5,000. And here, I'll multiply the bread. Can you hand it out? So they were all working together. So they were very, very involved. Jesus didn't just do things or have them do them, but they would also work at things together. It was very keeping them involved. That was part of his ministry. Next, he would warn. If people were doing something that wasn't going to work out well, he'd tell them. Or he'd give prophecies. That's where we have Matthew 24, the signs of the end of the world. He's giving warnings, right? So he often would warn people. And so part of good discipleship is warning people as well. You want to let people know what's coming up down the pike and how to prepare for that, right? So part of good discipleship, part of his methodology is to warn people. And then to challenge them. He'd tell the prostitute, lady caught in adultery, he says, go and sin no more, right? So he challenged him, go and sin no more. He would challenge Peter. Peter wanted to walk on water. He says, you want to challenge? Go ahead, try it. So he challenging people. With the feeding the 5,000, they said, well, we don't have any food. He said, well, you feed him. Us feed him. We only have a little bit of food. He's challenging them, right? You see him challenging his disciples over and over and over. And it's also in part of when he says that he who hath ears to hear, let him hear. He's challenging him to take what I'm teaching and do it, right? Do it. As part of being a disciple and part of a disciple maker is learning how to challenge people to take what they're learning and put it into practice. Get out there and do it. All right, so you've got the challenging, and then you've got the correcting. Where they're saying, who's going to be the greatest? He corrects them and says, no, be a child. So you've got that. And you've got the prophecy. We talked about that. And you've got the commission. So you have Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20, where he takes the reins and hands them over. He takes, look, I've been in charge here. Now it's your turn. And he turns them loose and says, look, even greater things than I have done, you will do. So being able to pass those reins over. And that's all part of the methodology that Christ used to pass those reins along. If you never pass reins on, never take the role you're carrying out and give it to somebody else, then the church won't grow. You've got to be able to take those responsibilities and pass them on so someone else they'll make mistakes. They'll make them. Sometimes the disciples tried to cast demons out and it didn't work, or they got confused. That's all part of it. And Jesus said, "I'll meet you on the other side." He wasn't going to condemn them for that or toss them out. Instead, he passes the reins over, giving more opportunity to practice. So we have that concept of passing the reins over. So it's all part of the methodology that Christ used to raise up disciples and send them out. Because only when we can do that, that we can effectively reach not only these people, to help them to embrace what it means to actually be disciples of Jesus, but to help them also to assist us in reaching out to these people, to help them understand that the better lives are available as disciples of Jesus, and then to reach out to effectively not just make more people where 2/3 don't practice. We don't want to have these people become Christians and have 2/3 of them not practice. What we're actually wanting is to have all of these become believers and all of them practice. To actually all of them be disciples, those that hear and do, right? That's what we're looking for. So we need to embrace this whole idea of discipleship, put it into practice here, get it done. Yeah, get it done. So we're ready for and then the one last one, and this is probably, if I were to say, the one that is probably the most important and the least remembered, and that's the issue of pace and priority. To know what should come first, and then how fast people can move. And one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible is wrapped around that. If you look in John 16:12, Jesus told his disciples, look, there's many things I'd like to tell you, but you're not ready yet. Well, I'm ready. I know all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of things I'd like to tell you, but you're not ready yet. And that one issue is what, no matter how much I know, are the people ready for that? Making sure that they get what they need when they need it, but not giving them things that they're not prepared to embrace yet. Like that concept right there is so vital, so critical. We often offer people information they're not ready for, there's no interest in, it's not going to help them, they're not prepared to take it, hear and do. They're not ready for that yet, but we give it to them because we know it. We just keep like a friend of mine says, like a fire hose, open your mouth, they can't drink that fast. And so being able to pace and priority, being able to ask the question, what do they need now? What's the most important thing? And then provide that at a pace that not only can they hear and understand, but they also put it into practice. So if a fellow was struggling with drug abuse and having major marriage problems, and say he was an alcoholic, and I wanted to talk to this fellow about Jesus, the question I would have to ask is, okay, so is this fellow ready to preach? Should I teach him all I know about preaching? Should I teach him all I know about prophecy? Should I teach him all I know about last day events? Should I teach him everything I know about this long list of sins that is in his life? Like, what should I teach this guy first, right? And my question would be, what is he asking for help with the most? And if he says, well, look, I'm actually wanting help with my marriage, then I would say, okay, that's probably a good place for us to start and talk about Christ, the plan of salvation, and how that can actually improve a marriage, and other practical tips the Bible has to offer about marriage. That's what he's looking for. Okay, discipleship would pace and priority. A lot of things I know, I'd like to share with you, but you're not ready yet. Yes, so provide what he is ready for, and give it to him in a way that he can embrace it, right? Okay, we see that in the most remarkable way in the first 15, 16 chapters of Acts. So Christ gives the Great Commission. He says, go therefore and bring the gospel. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. In Acts it says, starting with in Jerusalem, and then Judea, then Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. So you've got that progression there. And but the whole world is made out of Gentiles. And so does Jesus say, listen, I want you to make disciples of all nations? Oh, by the way, in order to do that, you're going to have to be able to talk to them. want to be able to eat with them. Making disciples, you got to eat with them. And I talk to large groups and small groups and go over all that. And so you have to do all that with these Gentiles. Did he do that? The answer is no. He told them to make disciples of all nations, but they didn't do it. In fact, if you read through the book of Acts, it says they went only to the Jews. So even when they went to foreign nations, if you look in Acts 11:19, even after they were being persecuted, so the Saul later became Paul, persecuting, killing, started with the stoning of Stephen, moves on. As they're persecuted and leave, verse 19, this is Acts 11:19, those who were scattered after the persecution that rose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, Antioch, preaching the word to nobody but the Jews only. So there was a Jew-only belief. Christ told them to make disciples everywhere, but they weren't doing it. They were traveling everywhere, but Jews only. So why? As you get into Acts 10 and 11, they were afraid of becoming contaminated. It's a fascinating story what God had to do to help them break out of that fear of being contaminated. And it works its way, chapter 10 and 11, big chapters for that. 12, you begin seeing the gospel progressing. And then you get over to chapter 15, and Paul brings the issue over to the Jerusalem council. Do they have to be circumcised? Well, this is, again, it's a Gentile issue. If they're being accepted, can we talk with them? Yes, you can talk with them. Can we eat with them? Yes, you can eat with them. That was resolved with Peter and Cornelius, that story in chapter 10 and 11. But do they have to be circumcised? The answer is yes. Okay, so they bring it to the Jerusalem council, and because Paul was convinced it should not be yes. And he asked the council for assistance, which is a fascinating step of faith, that Paul would take that issue about circumcision and lay it at the feet of a board of church leaders, every one of whom has been circumcised, and ask them, you make the decision. That to me, that's a huge step of faith in God, that God was going to work. It wasn't just these guys making a decision, but God was working through those leaders to make the decision. And in the end, the decision was made, no, they don't have to be circumcised. They don't have to be. So why didn't Jesus just cover this way back when he gave the Great Commission? He said, listen, I want you to take the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. That's like in Revelation, you see the added emphasis there. But he says, every nation, all nations, make sure they all have access to the gospel, right? So just do that. And by the way, you're not going to become contaminated if you touch them or talk to them. It's okay to go to their houses. It's okay to eat with them. And by the way, look, I died already, so you don't have to be circumcised anymore. That's all been done away with at the cross, so no more circumcision is required. Why didn't Jesus just say that? I would have saved a lot of hassle, a lot of confusion. Why didn't he just do it when he gave the Great Commission? That's when he told them to go to every nation on the earth, right? Why didn't he give it to them at that point? Or back there in Matthew 24:14, why didn't he do it then? It's because they weren't ready. And Christ wasn't willing to go faster than what his disciples could keep up with. That's why. He wasn't willing to go faster than what they could keep up with. And when they got to the point where work in Jerusalem was solid, and the leadership of the Christian church was solid, and persecution had actually pushed a little bit of space between the Jews and all their business and the Christians and their business. It kind of pushed a little space in between there. At that point, when Christians began to see themselves as a separate entity, making decisions. They had the Jerusalem council making decisions, as opposed to the religious leaders of the Jewish people making those decisions. As they began shifting in that little separation there, where they could actually make a decision like this, and then they'd already had the event taking place with speaking in tongues and angels being involved, the dream repeated 3 times in Acts 10. After those steps had already been in place, people had a chance to think about it, process it a little bit, and begin and learn to realize, look, we need to embrace the Gentiles into our fellowship. And after they had already taken those early steps, at that point, they're ready for the next step. And Christ simply waited. The Holy Spirit we see is the one that's kind of guarding and guiding and continuing his discipleship process in the book of Acts. He provided what was needed as it was needed to help them to embrace the changes that they're needing. But he's not going to push the early church faster than what it could keep up. If Peter at the very beginning had said, oh yeah, Jesus gave us the Great Commission, I think we need to accept Gentiles and don't worry about circumcision anymore. That's the thing of the past. If he had done it at that point, it would have killed the church right then and there. He simply wouldn't have been there. And cut off him. We can do the same thing with families and people that we're meeting, by pushing them faster than what they can keep up with. We can kill their interest right then and there. So what Christ was doing was he was modeling how to pace and priority, asking the question, what's the most important right now, and how do we manage that at a pace that they can keep up with? And when the next important thing is, again, how do we present it in a way that they're able to accept it, and then at a pace that they can keep up with? So pace and priority, those two. And you notice one of the most fascinating verses in Acts. After it's decided we can accept Gentiles into our brotherhood, and 2, they do not have to be circumcised. You have Acts chapter 16. So Paul, with the letter in hand from the Jerusalem council saying you don't have to be circumcised, right? So he's got that letter in his hand. He moves on. He's going to go into all the other churches that he's already gone to and strengthen their faith as he moves on. He came to Derbe, Lystra. That's where he was stoned. They left him for dead. And there's a certain disciple there. His name was Timothy. Paul wants to take Timothy with him as a protege, someone he could teach, guide along the way there. And he's going to teach him, his assistant. And it says, verse 3, Paul wanted to have him go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him. So Paul has this letter that says you don't have to be circumcised, and he's going to go and tell all the good news to all the Gentile churches you don't have to be circumcised. And as Paul begins that journey, he wants Timothy to go with him, and what's the first thing he does to Timothy? He circumcises him. He circumcises him. He took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region. Now, that's a critical part of this puzzle. Why in the world would Paul circumcise him? He says, for they all knew his father was a Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which are determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. And one of those decrees were you don't have to be circumcised, right? So this is a puzzle. Doesn't seem to make sense. But it appears that Paul says, listen, we don't want to push people faster than what they can keep up. Obviously, God has not pushed his church faster than what it can keep up. So I'm not going to push these Jewish synagogues faster than they can keep up. Obviously, if the Christian church itself wasn't ready to embrace this in the first so many years of following Jesus, obviously these new believers, or even not even believers, in some of the Jewish synagogues, they're not ready for that change yet. I'm not going to push them to make that change. So Timothy was circumcised not for the sake of Timothy's salvation. He was circumcised for the sake of the salvation of the Jews in the synagogues where they were going to go speak. If salvation was not truly, if circumcision was not a salvation issue, Paul simply wasn't going to make it a salvation issue. And it would have been if Jews had known Timothy was not circumcised and he was hanging out with Paul, they would have seen Paul as being dirty, and they would not have wanted him in one of the synagogues. So it would have been a real stumbling block to both of them being able to work together in ministry. So Paul says, listen, if it's not a salvation issue, let's not make it one. And so, again, it wasn't for Timothy's sake, but for the sake of the people he was working with. There again, the issue of pace and priority, one of the most profound techniques or methods, teaching methods that Christ himself used in discipleship. Don't push people faster than what they can keep up, and provide what they're needing as they need it, and move forward that way. So pace and priority, again, part of Christ's methodology in making disciples, the one I think we definitely need in the world we're living in today. So we're going to take a break now. You can, if you had a question you wanted to write in, feel free to do that. And we'll meet you back in a few minutes. Thank you. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, 10 minutes. Meet you back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, so apparently there's no questions. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but I'd like to think it's that at least people have wrestled with the idea of discipleship and get a better picture of what Jesus intended and the model that he used, and have some practical tips that they can use to practice discipleship in the communities that they're living in. If you do have any questions in the future you would like to ask, feel free to do so. My email address is dgoodson@afmonline.org. You should see it on the screen there. And you're more than welcome to simply write and ask me directly. If I don't know, I'll be happy to forward the question on to someone else maybe can answer those questions for you. So we'll try to get answers for you either way. And maybe we can have a short word of prayer here together to wrap up this little presentation this afternoon. If you want to join me in prayer. Lord God in the heavens, and Jesus, we know that you loved humanity and worked hard to help us understand the principles of your kingdom and how we can apply them in our lives, and that our lives, our families would be a little bit of heaven here on this earth, and we could be a salt and a light in the communities around us, to be a real blessing there. I pray that you would help us to embrace what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and to help spread the good news and help reach the unreached people and people in our communities that are really needing the kind of help that you have to offer. Pray that your Spirit would be with us to guide us, and that our own homes, Lord, would just be a treasure, a beautiful place to live in. And the people looking in at our homes would say, oh, please, I want what they've got. That would become true for everybody listening to this presentation. That's my prayer. Amen.